There was a kind of silence on the Cole farm that didn't belong to the weather. The hills around it, soft and slow like a sleeping beast, held back the wind in a way that made the trees stand straight but still. Even the birds flew past without resting long. The house itself was set low in the earth, boards bleached pale from decades of sunlight and rain, with a porch that creaked only when no one was near. The smoke from the chimney curled upward in a neat, steady line, no matter the hour, no matter the season. Inside, everything was clean. The floors were scrubbed so often that the grain of the wood had softened, and every window was wiped until the glass disappeared. Sheets were folded tight as ledgers. Clothes hung like they'd never been worn. The air smelled of boiled lye and dried rosemary, but behind that was something else, something faint, sour, and buried too deep for words. Susannah Cole, the mother, had a face built for Sunday church pews and casserole windowsills. Her hair was always pinned, her apron always white. She moved with a quiet rhythm, never rushed, never still. Each morning began before light and ended long after dark, her hands never idle, her mouth always humming the same low tune. It had no words and no melody, just a pattern of noise that never stopped, as if she feared silence might speak back. Her husband had died years before in a logging accident, or so people said, though no one remembered the funeral. Since then it was just her and the children, though no one seemed sure how many children there were. Sometimes 4, sometimes 5. The older boy, Elam, was seen in town once a month buying flour and soap. The others stayed behind. Neighbors said they were well-behaved, quiet, respectful, but no one had ever heard them laugh. At the edge of the farm sat a crooked barn that leaned slightly east, as if bowing to something underground. Inside, the hay was always fresh, the tools always in place, the feed sacks untouched by mice. But the loft, the upper place where children might play or dream, was empty. Clean, swept, lined with salt in a way no one could explain. Beneath the house, the root cellar smelled of stone and iron, and the soil never seemed dry. No vegetables were stored there, only canned things, jars without labels, sealed so tight the glass warped. Occasionally a visitor might ask what she grew, and Susannah would smile. Turnips, she'd say, always turnips. People liked her, or rather, they liked what she represented. Stability, grace, the kind of hard woman who didn't ask for help and didn't offer gossip. No one had ever seen her raise her voice. No one had ever seen her cry. But there were whispers, the kind that stayed behind teeth and didn't cross fence lines. A mail carrier once said he heard something crying inside the chimney. A field hand who came to mend the fence said the youngest daughter had no shadow in the morning light. One man claimed that the hearthstone in the kitchen was warm even after the fire went out. Another swore the warmth pulsed like something breathing below it. But these were poor folk in a hard land. Hunger twisted thoughts, and grief made ghosts out of corners. Most people looked the other way, because on the outside the Cole farm was decent, safe. There were no gunshots, no screams, no drunken rages. Just the gentle hum of a woman doing her work, the tight-lipped nod of a boy buying nails, and a line of white sheets fluttering on the line like holy flags. And maybe that's what made it worse. The quiet didn't feel earned. It felt designed. As if the stillness wasn't peace but camouflage. As if something had folded itself so neatly into that house, into those hills, into those children's eyes, that no one knew what was missing until it was already too late. Mercy Knoll had delivered more children than she could remember, though she remembered their mothers. She remembered the way women looked at her when the pains began. Frightened, grateful, sometimes angry. She remembered the names whispered just before dawn and the silences that followed when no name was given. In her small black journal she wrote them all down. not just for record-keeping, but to keep something of them alive, even if it was just a line of ink on dry paper. She lived alone on the South Road, close enough to walk to the farms when needed, far enough that no one visited unannounced. At 53, her back ached every morning and her hands trembled at night, but her mind stayed sharp, especially when it came to things that didn't fit. It began with the Cole births. The first had been in winter, cold enough that her breath turned to frost indoors. Susannah Cole had sent for her late in the evening, no urgency, just a plain request. The delivery was quiet, too quiet. The child had come in under 3 hours, barely crying, barely moving, and Susannah had taken it without asking Mercy to swaddle or weigh it. Mercy had waited, hand still damp with blood, for a name, but Susannah only said the child would not be named until morning. The next morning, when Mercy returned to check for fever, the cradle was gone. Susannah said the child was resting and pointed toward the kitchen where nothing sounded like sleep. She said his name was Elias. Mercy wrote it down. 2 months later, Mercy was called again. Another birth, another child, a girl born breech but healthy. This time, Susannah said her name was Edeline. When Mercy opened her journal, she paused. Elias, she remembered, the boy, but no one had seen him, not even Elam, and the graveyard behind the chapel hadn't added a new plot since October. Edeline was taken into another room without a sound. No crying, no feeding, no mess. Mercy asked how Elias was, and Susannah only smiled and said, "He's quiet like his father." Mercy made a note in her journal. Edeline B. Feb 6, no sign of Elias, house very clean, too clean. It wasn't evidence, it was discomfort, but discomfort stays longer than doubt. Mercy began to study, not accuse, not ask, just study. She visited the family 3 times in 6 months, and each time there was a new child. Once, a boy named Thomas. Another time, a girl named Lila. All healthy, all silent, none ever seen again. And the strangest part, each delivery was identical, same room, same position, same hours, and always afterward Breitauben. Susannah's hands smelled faintly of ash, even after washing. Mercy stopped trusting her own memory and leaned on the journal more. Her entries turned sharper, more detailed. Thomas B. March, 27, hearth still burning. Room unusually warm despite storm, child's eyes open but unfocused. The townsfolk weren't interested, babies died. Farms kept their grief private. It was impolite to ask why no one ever saw the children twice, and Susannah was respected. She donated linens to the church, made candles for the winter festival, and her son Elam read scripture without stuttering. But Mercy noticed what others did not. The air inside the Cole house always seemed too still. The windows never fogged from breath. The sheets on the cradle never wrinkled, and the fire never died, even in midsummer. One morning, Mercy came early, too early. The sun had just begun to rise, and the mist still clung low to the ground. She stepped into the kitchen without knocking. Susannah wasn't there. The fire was burning as always, but the cradle was empty. Not just empty, gone. Replaced with a flat woven rug that was still damp underneath. When Mercy stepped on it, she felt the warmth, not from the fire, from below. The stone beneath the rug seemed to pulse. She lifted one corner and felt smooth wood beneath it, polished, faintly oiled, too clean for a farmhouse. She lowered it again and stood still, heart quiet, breath shallow. In her journal that night, she did not write a name. She did not write a birth. She only wrote a single line, slowly, as if afraid the page might resist it. The floor is warm, and the cradle has no dust. She didn't stop visiting. She didn't speak out. But she began placing white thread around the ankles of each child before they were carried away. Not tightly, just enough. Thread to remember by. But none of the threads were ever returned. Not even by accident. not even in ashes. Susannah Cole folded grief like she folded bedsheets, tidy, tight, and without air. When her husband died under a fallen tree nearly 8 years before, she wore black for exactly 23 days, then stepped back into pale cotton as if mourning had an expiration date. The preacher said she was strong. The neighbors said she was God-fearing. Her children said nothing at all. They trailed behind her like shadows that had forgotten how to reach sunlight. Inside the Cole house, it was always quiet. Not peaceful, not restful, quiet in the way of a sealed jar. No one spoke indoors unless spoken to, and even then, words were short and round with no room for questions. Susannah's rules were carved into habit, not discipline. Her children didn't disobey because they feared punishment. They didn't disobey because they didn't know how. She sang often, but never to anyone in particular. The lullabies had no warmth to them, just rhythm, repetition, old syllables pressed flat by time. She would hum as she stirred broth that never boiled, whisper verses while folding the same set of napkins, and on days when the mist curled low to the windows, she sang into the corners of empty rooms. The sound was too steady to be comforting. It filled the house like steam, thick and shapeless, erasing the need for speech. Her voice never cracked, not even when Mercy arrived with bloodied hands and newborn cries that didn't last long. Susannah would take the child without looking into its face, press its chest against her apron, and walk calmly toward the back of the house. Always the same door, always the same slow click of the latch. What Mercy began to notice was not what Susannah did, but what she never did. She never asked about the child's weight or whether its eyes were strong or if its fingers curled properly. She never cried, not at the sight of blood, not at the stillness of breath, not at the silence that followed hours of pain. She never panicked, never showed fatigue, never rested during labor. She washed everything herself, always with the same pale rag, always with hands that moved like she was polishing something sacred. The hearth was cleaned every morning before dawn, even if it had burned all night. The floor beneath the cradle was scrubbed dry, even when there was no cradle. Her rituals were not habits. They were arrangements, precise, repetitive, ritualized acts that gave her control over something Mercy could not yet name. The children moved through the house like echoes. Elam was the oldest, and his face had grown sharp in recent years, but never unkind. His eyes were steady and his silence felt earned, like someone who had learned to think without words. The younger ones, when they appeared, seemed less real. One girl, thin as twine, followed Susannah with eyes so wide and empty they made Mercy's chest ache. She blinked rarely and never smiled. Another child, a small boy with a swollen lip, clutched a worn cloth as if it were flesh. Mercy tried to speak to him once quietly by the porch rail. The boy opened his mouth, then froze, not from fear but obedience, as if something deeper than fear had instructed him to keep still. Susannah appeared at the doorway a moment later, hands in flour, voice smooth. She said the children were taught to listen more than speak, that it built strength, that it pleased God. Mercy began writing more in her journal, not names or dates anymore, just fragments, phrases. White cloth never stained. Ashes swept clockwise. No candle smoke. She watched as Susannah scraped under the hearthstone with a brass-handled knife, then wiped it with a cloth she later burned. She saw her rinse her hands in vinegar and salt, then press her palm against the stove's side, not to test heat but as if offering something. She always hummed afterward. One tune, never new, always soft, the sound of forgetting. When Mercy finally asked about Elias, the firstborn no one ever saw, Susannah paused. Not long, just enough. Then she said Elias had been delicate, that he'd been taken early. Taken, not lost. She used the word like it had weight, like it had purpose. She didn't look angry. She looked relieved. Then she asked if Mercy wanted tea, and as she turned to boil water, she reached for the kettle with a hand wrapped in fresh linen, though there had been no wound the day before. Mercy watched the way the cloth was tied, tight, neat, symmetrical, like something bound, not healed. That night, Mercy returned home and wrote only one thing. She weeps, but inward, and I think she folds the sadness into something else, something clean. The barn behind the Cole house was half collapsed at one corner, with its east beam sagging like a rib too tired to hold shape. From the outside, it looked like any other rural shelter, mud-rubbed, vine-choked, barely standing. But Susannah kept it locked, not with a chain, but with a carved wooden peg fitted tight into the jamb, shaped just enough to seem natural but smooth from use. When Mercy slipped it free one morning under the excuse of searching for fresh straw, the air inside felt wrong. Not stale, something worse, preserved, as if whatever lived there had been sealed long ago but never died. Dust floated in the shafts of sunlight slanting through the gaps in the wood, and the floor was swept clean except for a long, shallow mark leading from the far wall to the middle of the space where an old cradle sat alone. It wasn't hidden. That made it worse. It was placed with intention, perfectly centered, framed by nothing. Its wood was darker than the barn's walls, almost black, with carvings so worn they looked melted. Around the edge of the base, lined carefully beneath each leg, was a thin circle of salt, not spilled, placed. Inside the cradle was a tiny quilt stitched with patterns that didn't belong to any family Mercy knew. Lines crossed into spirals, shapes into eyes, all sewn in red thread. In the corners of the cradle, small bundles of string had been tied into tight knots. Some softened with time, others crisp with something that looked like resin. Beneath the quilt, tucked like an offering, was a stitched infant's cap, turned inside out. One corner was stiff. Mercy touched it and drew her hand back quickly. Not because it was sharp, because it was warm. At the base of the cradle, she noticed a small pile of dried leaves tucked behind a support beam. She reached in, brushing aside the debris, and found a cluster of withered herbs bound with a length of braided human hair. Beneath it, 3 tiny bones. Not animal. Their shape was wrong, thin, almost fragile, like pieces of a jaw or hand. They had been placed in a triangle with a small, round seed pressed into the center like a pupil. Mercy's breath caught. Her knees weakened. She backed away and steadied herself against the wall, the weight of the silence pressing harder than the air itself. It wasn't superstition. That became clear to her then. Superstition was born of fear and confusion. But what she saw here was structure, arrangement. Someone had taken time to learn these actions, not just perform them, but refine them. The salt line had no break. The knots weren't decorative. They were bound with purpose, each one different in count. The herbs were not grown wild in Tennessee. They smelled faintly of copper and rain. And the cap, that innocent object of warmth and softness, had been inverted, as if to silence the spirit that once wore it. Mercy touched the cradle's side again. It rocked slightly, and she heard something shift beneath the floor. Not a rat, not wind, something heavier, something paced. She didn't tell anyone, not yet. She went home and tried to forget, but that night her dream split open. She heard crying, not sharp or loud, but distant, like it came from deep beneath the soil. In the dream, she was kneeling in the Cole house kitchen, pressing her ear to the hearthstone. Beneath it, something wept and sucked air through broken teeth. When she woke, her hands were clasped tightly at her chest, her fingers curled into her skin like she was holding something she hadn't meant to carry. She looked down and saw a smear of salt across her wrist and a red thread tangled in her hair. She burned her night clothes, She boiled water and scrubbed her floors. But the smell of that barn returned each time she closed her eyes. Not decay, something worse, something sacred but only to the wrong kind of God. The fire in the coal house was always burning. Even in August, when the air pressed down like a wet cloth and the children's backs dripped with sweat before midday, the hearth still glowed steady behind the iron grate. It never blazed, never flickered wildly, just a quiet, obedient flame that never stopped. At first glance, it seemed comforting. Like everything in the Cole home, it gave the impression of order, of control, of someone who knew the value of a home's heart. But over time, Mercy Knoll noticed what others didn't. The heat didn't match the wood. The logs placed in the grate were thin and brittle, not enough to keep even a stove warm, and yet the stone surrounding the hearth was always hot to the touch, hot enough to sting. And the smell, always faint, always just beneath the broth and the soap, was not ash or cedar or smoke. It was something metallic, something sweet and wrong. It was a traveler that made her look closer. A man passing through from Memphis, tired and gray-skinned, asking for water and shade. Susannah offered him a place to rest inside, and he accepted. But within moments of sitting near the hearth, his face turned white and his body sagged. He fainted without warning, collapsed like someone who'd been struck. Susannah said it was the heat, said he'd been walking too far. She fetched water, dabbed his brow, and when he woke, she pressed dried leaves beneath his tongue and sent him on his way. He didn't make it past the boundary fence before vomiting. Mercy had watched it all from the garden gate, and when she asked later what the leaves were, Susannah simply smiled and said they were for settling the spirit. Mercy didn't write that down. She didn't need to. The image stayed burned in her memory. The man falling beside the hearth like a puppet with cut strings, the thick heat hanging in the air, and that low hum that always seemed to rise in Susannah's throat when she touched the fire poker. Later that week, Mercy returned under the guise of checking on Susannah's foot, which she claimed had blistered during baking. The children were out tending to laundry, and Susannah was calm as always, sitting by the hearth with a bowl of peeled apples untouched in her lap. As Mercy knelt to examine the ankle, her eyes drifted toward the fire. The wood was stacked neatly, but there was something beneath it, something blackened and smooth, not like bark, but dense, like bone. She shifted slightly, and the smell thickened, not smoke, not soot, something closer to iron and honey. The hearthstone directly in front of it was cleaner than the rest of the floor, scrubbed to a polish. The kind of polish that came from more than water. The kind that came from boiling, from scraping, from oil. Her hand brushed it once, and she felt a heat that had nothing to do with the fire above it. It pulsed, not steadily, not like breath, like memory. That night, Mercy returned home and boiled her own rags before touching anything else. She sat for hours at her kitchen table, not writing, not sleeping, just watching the empty fireplace in front of her. Cold, normal, safe. But in her mind, she kept returning to the coal hearth, to the sound of the faint hiss behind the fire, to the strange way Susannah watched it, not like someone enjoying warmth, but like someone guarding something, like someone waiting for it to speak. In her next journal entry, Mercy finally used the word she had avoided for months. She wrote, "The hearth is not for cooking. It is not for warmth. It is for keeping, for sealing, for holding something that should not be loose." She pressed her pen so hard into the paper that the ink bled through to the next page. She tore it out, burned it, then rewrote the same line in smaller, tighter letters. She could no longer ignore the rhythm, the pattern. The fire was not incidental. It was not tradition. It was ritual. Something fed it that was not wood. Something needed it to remain lit, and the hearthstone itself, smooth and steaming, was not a surface. It was a lid. and Mercy feared what had once been placed beneath it had not been buried but preserved, kept warm so it would not sleep, kept burning so it would never forget. The ledger at the county office smelled of ink and mildew, its pages bloated by time and weather. Mercy turned each one slowly, her fingers trembling more than usual as she traced the neat black script of death entries. 3 names appeared in separate lines, all written in the same hand, all belonging to Susannah Cole. The cause listed for each was stillbirth. No further details, no midwife signatures, no official witness. The dates spanned 4 seasons, one child marked as lost in spring, another midsummer, the third just before frost began. No follow-up inquiries, no notations of clergy, no mention of burial. Mercy stared at the words until they blurred, but they didn't vanish. She had attended only one of those births, and it had not been still. The child had cried, just once, a brief gurgled sound like breath being borrowed. Mercy remembered her own hands shaking as she passed the child to Susannah, who had not looked at it. She had turned and walked toward the far room with her shoulders stiff and steady. The door had closed gently. That was the last she saw of that child. She went to the churchyard next, walked row by row through the crooked stones and rusted crosses, some names long eaten by moss. There was no trace of the Cole name among the children's section. No Elias, no Edeline, no Lila, not even unmarked soil where someone might pretend a sorrow had been placed. She asked the groundskeeper, a bent old man with fading eyesight. He said he'd never buried a Cole child, said he'd have remembered. They always brought pies when someone died, but no pie ever came with Susannah. Back at the farm, behind the smokehouse where sunlight never stayed long, there was a dry patch of earth where roses grew but never bloomed. They were thick with thorns, sharp and overgrown, but not once had Mercy seen a single bud open. The ground was harder there. She noticed it during one visit when Susannah had sent Elam to fetch wood. Mercy had stepped behind the smokehouse to relieve a cough and nearly tripped over a raised edge of soil. Not a stone, not a root, just something firm beneath a thin crust of dead grass. She pressed her heel into it gently. It did not sink, and for the first time since she had known her, Mercy felt afraid of the ground. She began taking notes more often, short phrases in shorthand scribbled into the lining of her coat when no one looked. She counted meals, children's faces, times of day when the hearth hissed instead of crackled. She noted that no one ever fetched water from the stream after sunset, that Susannah locked the pantry with a brass key shaped like a bell, that there were never flies in the kitchen, even on the hottest afternoons. The more Mercy noticed, the more she felt herself drifting, not into madness but into clarity. A slow understanding that what she had thought was strange might actually be intentional. That these weren't gaps of grief or neglect, but choices made carefully by a woman who never allowed dust to gather and never let emotion show on her face. One evening, as shadows stretched long across the porch, Susannah invited her to stay for tea. Her voice was soft, almost warm. She said Mercy had been working too hard, that she should rest her bones. Mercy hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the fire burned low, just enough to warm the room. The air was sweet with herbs she couldn't name. The tea was already steeped, too dark, too hot. Mercy did not drink. Instead, she asked about the roses behind the smokehouse. Susannah's expression didn't change. She said the soil there was poor. She had tried everything, but nothing took root. She smiled again and gestured toward the guest bed prepared with fresh linens. Said she'd be honored if Mercy stayed the night. And in that moment, Mercy felt something shift. Not in the room, not in the air, but in herself. The feeling that she was no longer a visitor, that she had been drawn inward, step by step, towards something that had already named her. Something waiting behind warmth and comfort, behind tea and pleasantries. Something that didn't need to bury its dead because it never intended to let them go. Elam Cole was the only one who ever looked long enough to be noticed. The others moved too quietly or stood too still, their presence like shadows sewn to corners. But Elam had the eyes of someone half awake, someone who had learned to watch without being caught, and who no longer feared what he saw. Mercy had always sensed something in him, an ache that sat too deep for words, a kind of hunger not fed by food or affection. He moved like someone who knew that sound could be dangerous. He rarely left the farm, and when he did, it was only to fetch things from town with a folded list and exact change, never looking anyone in the eye for longer than needed. His speech was said to be poor. Folks thought he was slow or mute or touched. But Mercy had always doubted that. The silence didn't come from ignorance. It came from precision. Then one night, Elam spoke. It was late summer and the heat clung like wet cloth. Mercy had returned to the Cole house after sunset with a bundle of herbs and clean linens. Susannah had claimed one of the girls had fallen ill with fever, though no one answered when Mercy called her name. Elam met her at the door, barefoot, his hands shaking, his lips pressed tight. His mouth was red, raw, peeling. His breath smelled sharp, like soap left too long in scalding water. She followed him inside and noticed the faint trace of white powder at the corner of his lips and a blistered line down the edge of his chin. When she reached out to wipe it, he flinched, but didn't run. Then he whispered. At first, the sound was nothing, just a soft croak, a breath caught in the throat. Then the words took shape. Hollow under the warm stone, that's what he said over and over. Hollow under the warm stone. His tongue was swelling, darkening, the edges cracked like split bark. His voice cracked with blood, but he said it again. Hollow under the warm stone. Mercy froze. The hearth. She wanted to pull him outside, to rinse his mouth, to lift him and carry him far from whatever place had taught him silence. But before she could move, Susannah appeared behind her, holding a folded cloth and a spoon. Her voice was calm. She said Elam had taken something he shouldn't, that he was prone to fits, that he was tired. She offered him the spoon, and he took it without looking at Mercy. He drank whatever was inside without blinking. That was the last time Mercy saw him. By morning, the bed was empty. His shoes were missing. No footprints led from the porch. When asked, Susannah said he had gone north to help a neighbor with fencing. But there was no neighbor north for miles. Mercy walked to town that afternoon and asked the postmaster if Elam had been seen. The man only frowned and said he thought the Coles had 2 daughters, not a son. Mercy asked at the feed store. The owner shook his head. Said he didn't think Susannah had any children left. Said he'd heard they'd all died young. Mercy stood in the chapel yard at dusk, trying to remember the exact lines of Elam's face. She had seen him for years, watched him grow from a pale boy into a thin, silent man. But now the town had erased him without argument, without malice, just absence. A hollow carved where memory should have been. She returned home and opened her journal, but found that the page where she'd once written his name was missing, torn clean. Not ragged, not accidental, removed with care. Her hands shook. She pressed the book to her chest and sat beside her own cold hearth, listening to the wind whistle through the slats in the wall. She whispered his name to herself over and over, trying to hold it in place. But even that began to fade, not from forgetfulness, but from something colder, something that made space in her mind like a stone being warmed from beneath. And for the first time, Mercy understood. Silence wasn't protection. It was payment. And the price had already been collected. The warmth beneath the hearth had always been too much. Even in winter, the stone gave off a slow, steady heat that didn't feel earned by the firewood stacked above it. Mercy had knelt near it many times under the pretense of retrieving a kettle or setting kindling, but she never let her hand rest too long on the surface. It wasn't just hot. It felt wrong, like touching a bruise that hadn't healed or skin flushed from fever. The heat had a rhythm to it, not natural, not random, a slow throb that pulsed through her bones if she stayed close too long. That evening, with the sun low behind the hills and Susannah away tending to her goats, Mercy made her move. The room was quiet, too quiet. Even the birds had stopped. She laid the iron poker beside her and pressed her palms against the hearthstone, steadying herself. The surface felt alive, not in a poetic sense, but in the sick way a wound breathes when it's opened. She pushed harder and the stone shifted. Just slightly, enough to show that it wasn't fixed in place. She wedged the poker into the seam and pried it upward. The stone groaned softly as it rose, the sound swallowed quickly by the thick, hot air that poured out from beneath it. And then the smell hit her. Not smoke, not ash. Something closer to boiled sugar and rotting teeth. Beneath the lifted hearthstone was a shallow cavity. Not deep, but wide enough to hold something curled. The walls of the space were slick with a black resin that shimmered faintly in the firelight. At first she thought it was just old wood soaked in oil, but then she saw the cloth, a bundle of pale fabric browned and cracked at the seams. Baby gowns, dozens of them, folded in half, stitched together, hardened by pitch. Some still held buttons. Some had frayed lace. One had a red thread sewn around the collar in the shape of a spiral, now burned stiff into the cloth. She reached toward them, hand trembling, and the heat licked up her wrist like breath. The bottom of the cavity shimmered, as if a thin layer of moisture steamed just below the resin. Mercy blinked. The air thickened. As she leaned closer, she coughed. A dry sound at first, but then something caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, clutching her chest, hacking into her sleeve. When she looked down, her palm showed not spit, but thread, thin black strands like hair tangled and damp. She wiped her mouth again, and more came out, wet threads clinging to her tongue, curling at the corners of her lips. The fire beside her hissed louder, like it had noticed her intrusion. The air in the room dropped suddenly, not in temperature, but in weight. As if the house itself had taken a breath and now waited to exhale. She lowered the stone back into place with both hands. It settled into its groove without resistance. The moment it did, the air shifted again. Lighter now, almost normal. Her coughing stopped. The warmth returned to a low, even hum. But something had changed. Not in the room. In her. A part of her had touched something real. No longer suspicion. No longer fear drawn from symbols or stories. This was contact. Flesh to heat. Cloth to skin. She staggered outside, wiped her face with her apron, and sat beneath the porch eave until her breath came steady. The threads were gone. Not one in her mouth, not one on her sleeves. She checked again. Nothing. When she stood, her knees shook. She walked home in silence, her shadow long and thin across the dirt. That night she did not write in her journal. She burned it, all of it, every page. Watched the ink twist in the flame. Then she sat on her floor, her back to the cold fireplace, and whispered to herself the names she remembered. Not aloud, just enough to make sure her tongue still worked, just enough to remind herself they were real. The nursery had always felt hollow to Mercy, too tidy for the number of births Susannah claimed, too clean for a room meant to hold the noise of life. No scuff marks, no worn corners on furniture, no blankets left crumpled in exhaustion. Just a cradle, always the same one, always empty, and a rocking chair that barely creaked no matter how many hours Susannah sat in it humming to herself. It wasn't until one evening when Mercy offered to stay and help tend to a newborn said to be struggling with fever that she noticed something high in the corner of the ceiling. A small iron bell fixed not on a wall or door but directly above the cradle. It was old, not decorative, thinly rusted with a clapper of blackened brass. From it ran two cords nearly invisible in the low firelight. They split, disappearing down into the floorboards between the cradle and the hearth room beyond. Mercy stood beneath it longer than she should have. Her eyes traced the threads again and again, trying to find reason. The bell wasn't there to be seen. It was placed to be heard. But it wasn't rigged to a door. It wasn't rigged to the cradle either. The cords passed through the floor at angles too sharp, too purposeful. She crouched low and saw them vanish under a thin slat that had been waxed smooth. Smoothed not by time but by hands. Polished hands. She said nothing to Susannah. Just smiled and praised the quiet, then asked for water and time to wash. Later that night, Mercy did not sleep. She lay still on the cot in the guest room beside the nursery, eyes open, ears open wider. The house didn't creak the way others did. Its silence was layered like something placed over something else. A coverlet for the living. And then it came. A sound not loud, not sharp, just a single chime. One soft flick of metal against metal like breath catching on a tooth. The bell had rung. Only once. Mercy sat upright without thinking, her pulse already racing, her mouth dry. She listened for movement. Nothing followed. No child cried. No adult stirred, no wind passed. Just that one ring suspended in memory like a thread that could not be untied. She rose and opened the nursery door slow enough not to wake anyone, if anyone could wake. The cradle was still, the window unlatched. The iron bell above hung motionless, cords slack. She moved to the floor and pressed her ear to the wood near where the cords vanished. What she heard was not footsteps, not voices. It was closer to breath, deep, slow, and rhythmic, as if something slept beneath or waited. By morning, the cords were gone. The bell remained still rusted, still dull, but now only ornamental. Susannah served breakfast with her usual softness, poured tea with steady hands, and when Mercy asked about the bell, Susannah smiled and said it was a gift from Providence. She said it had always been there, that it once rang when the wind changed direction. She said such things were reminders, that even silence could be watched. Mercy nodded and pretended to laugh, but her fingers trembled so badly she could not lift her spoon. That evening, alone at her own hearth, Mercy traced the shape of the bell into the soot on her wall. Not out of habit, out of fear that she would forget it, that it too would vanish from her memory, as Elam had, as the children had, as her own written notes had begun to fade like ink left too close to heat. The bell had not been an alarm. It had been surveillance, a signal not to alert others, but to alert her. Something had moved beneath the floor, and someone had needed to know. Mercy finally began to understand. This house did not just hold evil, it studied it, fed it, preserved it under layers of cleanliness and ritual and quiet obedience. And now it was watching her back. The kitchen fire flared higher than it should have, snapping from the hearth with a spit of grease that didn't belong to food. Mercy had returned to the Cole home early that morning after hearing whispers of smoke thick enough to blacken the windows. But there had been no alarm, no panic, just Susannah, as always, calmly folding cloth by the doorway while her youngest stirred porridge in a bowl that never steamed. The air smelled wrong, not of wood or scorched bread, but of something chalky and sharp, like old teeth ground to powder. As Mercy stepped over the blackened threshold and into the soot-lined kitchen, she saw that the hearth had gone quiet, but the heat lingered like a secret not yet confessed. The floor beneath the hearth was darker than the rest of the room, smeared in ash that had not cooled properly. Susannah insisted it was from a cooking accident, said the fat from a ham joint had dripped into the coals. But Mercy had been in that kitchen too many times. She had watched how Susannah handled fire, never wasteful, never careless. That morning something had burned for longer than meat could manage. Mercy knelt with a cloth over her mouth and brushed her hand through the ash, slow and careful, until her fingers struck something hard. Not coal, not bone from a roast, smaller, lighter. She cleared away the ash until the pieces emerged, 7 tiny jawbones, dry and clean, arranged in a crescent pattern just beneath the surface. Each was perfectly shaped, some still showing the root of a first tooth, one with a hole that had never seen a thread of speech. Mercy didn't speak, not because of fear, but because the house itself seemed to lean inward, listening. Behind her, Susannah said it was rodents, said the barn cats dragged things in sometimes. Her voice was so calm, so sure, so warm that for one brief second Mercy believed her. But then she turned and her eyes landed on the eldest girl standing by the wash basin. She was holding her arms stiff at her sides, her face tilted slightly upward, her mouth trembling as if caught between two worlds. Then the tremble became a shudder. A jolt rolled through her body, not violent, not sudden, just slow and terrible, like something waking up inside her that she could no longer hold down. Her fingers curled and her knees buckled. But she made no sound. Not one cry. Not one word. Susannah moved quickly without raising her voice, lifting the girl in her arms with strength that defied her frame. She whispered something too quiet to hear, cradled the girl against her chest, and walked through the back hallway to the room Mercy had never been allowed inside. The door shut. The bolt clicked. Outside, a neighbor boy had vanished. His name was Caleb Rusk, 11 years old, last seen walking along the fence between his home and the Cole property just after sunrise. His parents sent word to the sheriff, but no one searched the Cole grounds. No one knocked on Susannah's door. The boy was simply noted as missing. Perhaps he ran off. Perhaps he drowned. Perhaps nothing. The town had begun to swallow disappearances like it swallowed rumors, slowly without chewing. That night, Mercy sat alone in her home, running her fingers across the soot that still clung to her apron. It was not the black that frightened her. It was the white, the powder beneath it that did not smear but scattered like pollen. Bone dust. She had known it the moment she touched it, not just seen it, felt it. The fragile remains of something never given a name, never laid in soil, never given the right to rot. And what haunted her more than the pattern of bones or the silence of the child was the way the house no longer tried to hide what it was. It was changing. She could feel it. The walls seemed closer, the heat thicker, the light more gray than golden. It was no longer pretending to be a home. It was shedding its skin. And Mercy knew she was not meant to leave with what she now knew. Not without cost, not without a trade, not without becoming part of the pattern. The door to the cellar had always been there, half hidden behind the pantry shelves where Susannah kept her jars of jam and neatly stacked sacks of flour. Mercy had passed it for years, never thinking to question its use. It looked like any root cellar, narrow frame, rusted hinges, worn latch. But when she pulled gently one morning under the pretense of helping with winter preserves, it did not budge. The lock was not new, but polished. No dust on the handle, no rust inside the keyhole. She didn't speak of it, not then. But when Susannah left that afternoon to attend a widow's gathering in town, Mercy returned with a small hammer and 2 slender nails wrapped in cloth. The pantry door groaned as it opened, as if the wood itself was warning her not to try. She pried the latch gently, working by feel more than sight, until the catch gave and the door creaked open. The air that met her was heavy, not stale, not foul, just thick, like breathing through syrup. She stepped down slowly, the wooden stairs groaning under her weight. At the bottom, the cellar split in two directions, one to the left toward shelves stacked with onions and wax-sealed crocks, and one to the right toward a wall made not of stone but plaster. White, smooth, too smooth for a cellar wall. She pressed her hand against it and found a seam barely wide enough to notice. Her fingers found a groove, a latch. She pulled. The wall gave way to a second chamber, and inside the air changed. It was colder here, though no breeze passed. The light from her lantern flickered as if unsure whether to move forward. What she saw first was the table, narrow, iron-legged, with a shallow porcelain basin at its center. Dried residue clung to its edge, thick golden brown like sap left too long in sun. On the wall behind it were shelves, 5 rows high. Each shelf held jars, dozens of them. Tall glass cylinders sealed with wax and marked with small handwritten labels. The ink had faded, but not completely. Mercy stepped closer, breath shaking, hand clutching the lantern so tightly the metal burned her skin. The names were written in tidy cursive: Elias, Edeline, Leela, Thomas. Beneath each name, a date, not a birth date, not a death date, just a day, a single day. And inside the jars, things, not fully formed, not wholly human. Curled shapes suspended in amber fluid, limbs too thin, skin too pale, faces either missing or turned inward. Some looked no larger than a fist, others nearly the length of a forearm. One floated with its hands pressed upward against the glass as if trying to escape or remember. Mercy counted 32 jars. She stopped counting after that. In the far corner of the room stood a small chest, half rotted, its lid cracked. Inside it were scraps of clothing, stained bonnets, broken rattles, teeth, loose like buttons. She reached for one and felt its edge, too sharp for a child, too clean to have come from the soil. And underneath it all, lining the bottom of the chest, were pages, torn from a ledger, not county records, personal notes, observations, words written in a firm hand. Too cold, tissue tore. Boil at low flame, preserves better. Thread around neck must be red or it fades. Mercy read each line slowly, mouth dry, eyes blurring with something heavier than grief. This was not madness. This was method. This was practice. Ritual refined into instruction. A process catalogued and repeated until perfected. No accident. No passion. Only preparation. She stepped backward until her spine touched the wall. Her knees nearly buckled. Not because of the horror of what had been done, but because the room was silent, perfectly silent, not a drip, not a breath, not even her own heartbeat, as if the room itself did not allow sound to live here. She sealed the door again, locked the cellar behind her, and walked out into the cold without speaking. Her feet moved on their own. She did not write that night. She did not sleep. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall until the morning came, and when the sun rose, it brought no warmth. Only the knowing that whatever was buried beneath that house was no longer resting. It was arranged, waiting, named, and perfectly preserved. Mercy waited until the sky lost its color. Twilight gave the fields a softness she could disappear into. Her satchel was packed tight. No food, no change of clothes, only paper. Dozens of pages folded into the lining, hidden beneath stitching tucked in the soles of her shoes. Her final records. Not all of them, but enough to damn the Cole name into memory. She did not know if the sheriff would believe her. She did not know if he was still alive, but she had to try. The cellar, the jars, the bell, the bones, each one a weight pressing down, and she could no longer carry it alone. Her boots barely made a sound as she crossed the porch. Her breath steamed once in the air. then stopped. The first rope came from behind, tied fast around her wrist before she could scream. The second pulled at her ankles. She buckled with a thud against the step, her voice caught in her throat not from fear but from something older. The door opened before she could turn her head. Susannah stood in the frame with a soft cloth in her hands, not to gag, not to bind, just to wipe Mercy's forehead. Her voice was calm. She said Mercy had worked too hard. That rest was overdue. Her hands moved with precision. She did not strike. She did not scream. She simply lifted Mercy beneath the arms and dragged her back across the threshold, humming as she went. They did not go to the hearth. They did not go to the cellar. They went to the nursery. The cradle had been moved, replaced by a long, narrow table covered in linen. Mercy's eyes scanned the walls for help, for tools, for anything. But the only thing that glinted was a scalpel, already clean, already waiting. Her tongue pressed against her teeth to bite it off, to keep herself from crying out. But it wasn't pain she feared. It was the silence that wrapped around her like a second skin. Susannah did not speak as she worked. The first cut was across Mercy's shoulder, shallow and slow. Then another across the forearm, then her back. And only then did Susannah begin to speak, not aloud, but through the blade. The cuts were not random. They formed letters, phrases, dates. Every line Mercy had ever written in her journals carved into the softest parts of her. Each note of birth, each suspicion, each child's name etched into her skin as confession, as punishment, as preservation. Elias Feb 2nd, breathing but blue. Edeline, no cord, no cry. Lilla, no body seen. Each word burned until it no longer hurt, until her nerves stopped reporting. But her mind didn't fade. Her memory stayed sharp. That was the true cruelty. Mercy was not to be silenced. She was to be rewritten. Her body was made into record, her own truths turned into marks she could never erase, never deny, never explain. When Susannah finally stopped, the air had cooled. The room smelled faintly of vinegar and blood. Mercy lay still, but her eyes never closed. Susannah placed a cloth over her, not to warm, but to cover the writing. She whispered something then, something Mercy would never repeat. And she left the room, locking the door behind her with a click that echoed louder than a scream. Mercy was found 2 days later wandering near the creek bed, barefoot, lips split, mouth dry. The man who found her thought she had been whipped. He took her to the chapel where the women undressed her to clean her wounds and found no pattern they could understand. Just words carved in lines too neat to be made in haste. They tried to ask her questions, but she never spoke, not once. Not even when shown her own name. She lived, but her voice did not. Her hands moved when prompted, but she never held a pen again. Her skin remained the only testimony. And no one knew what to do with it. Years passed. The Cole house burned in a sudden fire with no known cause. Susannah was never found. The land was resold and plowed, but the fire did not touch the hearthstone. It cracked but did not break. And under it, even decades later, the soil was always warm. Warm like a breath that had never finished. Warm like a name not yet spoken.